will the current volatility in food prices affect prospects for poverty reduction in our region?
There's really two different issues. There's the volatility and the level. Even though they have been quite volatile, food prices are still much higher than they were, say, 3 years ago. And as long as they stay roughly where they are, they're going to push a lot of people who are vulnerable deeply into poverty and push people who were not necessarily vulnerable into becoming vulnerable to fall into poverty. And this is because there are many people who 5, 8 years ago were just barely squeaking by. Then they benefited from the strong economic recovery in terms of getting better jobs with higher wages. But now, with the higher food prices, that absorbs so much of the consumer's budget in these countries, their real income is being decreased and they can be pushed back to where they were 3, 4, 5, 8 years ago. That's the challenge that's faced. And from a poverty reduction perspective, that's what's most difficult.
And what are some of the lessons learned from the different land reform strategies pursued by countries in our region over the past years?
Mm-hmm. The basic lesson is that any resource needs an owner who thinks about the long-term productivity of that resource and the wealth that can be generated from that resource. It's true of capital, it's true of coal, it's true of oil, and it's true of land. And the countries that have done the best in restoring their agricultural sectors during and after the transition are ones that have very clear owners. Either it's a peasant family that's the owner and they own their land, they own their cows, they own their access to water and other things they need, or it's a modern agribusiness where it's a corporation, but the ownership structure is quite well defined. Countries where the agricultural recovery has not been as strong are countries in which the ownership is not clearly defined. It's not clear really if it's the state or if it's some cooperative or some other kind of arrangement, and really what the responsibilities and roles of the different owners are. And in that circumstance, it's difficult to get access to credit. It's difficult to really take long-term investments to raise the productivity of the land. And it's difficult to ultimately be competitive in what are global markets for food. And so a country like Georgia or Kyrgyzstan on the one hand, or Slovakia or the Czech Republic on the other, have done well because it's clear who the owners are. And countries where the ownership is not so well defined, you don't have agricultural production at the levels that you saw, say, in 1990. That's the lesson there.
Most of the poverty found in our region is located, indeed, in rural areas. How can disparities between rural and urban areas be best addressed?
Well, it really depends who the vulnerable people are in the countryside. When we're talking about peasant households that are producing food and selling it, then the higher food prices is an opportunity for them because their real incomes can go up. But in order for them to take advantage, they have to be able to increase supply, and quickly. They have to be able to get more land, more water, more fertilizer, more fuel, more tractors, and they have to be able to take advantage of that. And that's not always the case. If we're looking at other members of the rural poor, such as workers who work on farms but don't own the land and don't get paid for the farm produce directly, then we have to hope that the higher incomes coming from the higher food prices trickle down to them. And in a case where the rural labor markets are relatively tight, where, say, there's been a lot of outmigration away from the countryside already to the cities, or to Moscow, or to the European Union, then it's relatively easier for food prices to be translated into higher incomes, higher wages for people working the fields. And then we have to ask questions about the people providing services to the farmers, people who are, for example, doing construction work in the countryside, or are providing water, irrigation services. If the higher food prices can quickly lead to more demand for their services, then the prosperity can spread broadly throughout the countryside. But the problem is that these things don't happen automatically. There's a need for the state to play a role, to build rural infrastructure, to provide extension services, to build roads, to make it easier for people in isolated communities to get their produce to the market, and to demonopolize markets for inputs and outputs so that the agriculture producer can get the best price for his or her output and buy the inputs needed at as low a price as possible. And these are very difficult challenges, and not all of the countries of the region are as effective in responding to them as others.